Hello. Hello and welcome back to Weston the Historian. Today I have a video which is actually based on a tweet that I saw. So it was a tweet about finding a better word to describe being attracted to someone that doesn't sound animalistic or something like that, or low or class or too based. And by based I mean like base desire. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. So I was thinking about it, and because they're more or less talking about poetry and there is like this notion of there being a more poetic way of saying things. And when people are referring to a poetic way of saying things, of expressing things, what they really mean is sugarcoating things, using fancy words to make things sound fancy. And that's what they mean when they say a poetic way of saying things. They don't mean making it sound like something an actual poet would write. They mean making it sound fancy, making it sound high class. And a lot of times you will see poets do that. However, most of the greatest poets did not write in that way. And I personally do not actually think that poets should. So in order to understand what poets should do, I wanted to talk about the role of poets, because no matter how much a poet wants to be writing a poetry for themselves, if they're releasing poetry into the world, they're interacting with society in some way, and they have to interact with society in some way if they're writing poetry that other people are meant to read. And there is a sort of role that a poet should have in society, and there is a role that some poets should have. And I myself consider myself a poet. I write poetry. I've released a poetry book, which I hope everyone here watching this checks out. It's in the description. But I have a sort of role that as I've continued writing poems, I've kind of been like, I need to write in this sort of way to achieve this sort of effect. And I think other poets should kind of have like this sort of view of themselves, that they have a role that they have to do, and they can't just do whatever they want. So I wanted to talk about that. So some of this is inspired by myself and my own experience. Some of this is inspired by my readings, specifically of Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks a good deal about the role of poets. I remember being fascinated by what he said in Human All Too Human. He talks about that a good deal. So let's just jump right into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is that I think poets need to be able to understand and expose human nature. So in some sense, the poet should act as kind of a philosopher. They should have a good grasp of philosophy and have a good grasp of the world and how it works and how humans work. And they should understand how they work. And by understanding how they work, they can understand how other people work. And they can also be kind of a psychologist in that sense, or digging through other people and understanding how humans work. Because when you're a poet, you're writing about the human experience, usually. Like even when you're writing about things that technically don't have any human characters in your poems, like if you're writing about nature, you're still kind of writing about how humans interact with nature. You're writing about how a human views nature. There have been very few poets and very few poems I can think of where they were like taking on the experience of like an ant or something. When a poet writes about nature being beautiful, that's a very human way of looking at nature. An ant is not going to think of nature in the same way. So no matter what, 9 times out of 10, a poet is writing about the human experience. So in order to write about the human experience and relate to other people, you have to be kind of a philosopher in a way, but not a philosopher in the way of Aristotle, who is kind of just directly telling you how people work and directly telling you how the world works and how it should work, and writing lists about the best types of governments and whatnot. You have to read that stuff and you have to understand it, but you have to put it in a way that's digestible. Because the vast majority of people are not going to be reading dense philosophy books, and they're not going to be able to really connect with it as well as they could connect with a poem. So I think that's why it's important for a poet to understand the human experience and to be kind of a philosopher in a sense. So yeah, so that's one thing, understanding human nature, but also when I say expose human nature, I mean not only do they need to understand it, they need to be able to bring it to light. They shouldn't sugarcoat it. Like when talking about attraction to someone else, you should not be trying to sugarcoat it as a poet. You shouldn't be trying to make it sound more dainty and fancy as it really is. I think trying to be as raw and animalistic as as possible, I don't actually think that's a bad thing. I think most poets will shy away from that, and I think most people do not actually think that that's a poetic thing to do, but I personally think that that's great. I think when you're writing poetry about uh, about depression or attraction or whatever, I don't think it's good to sugarcoat it. I think it's good to just tell it as bluntly and as raw as it is. I think being raw is a good thing when it comes to poetry, and of course you're gonna read poems that aren't like that, and they can be very, very good. But I do think trying to pretend that humans aren't also animals is a little silly. I don't like to I don't really subscribe to that kind of atheist idea that we're all just animals or whatever, and trying to be gross. I don't think you should ever try to be gross as a poet, but I do think it is good to understand that humans are flawed and also animals. So when writing poetry, you really shouldn't shy away from acknowledging that humans are animals and can be animals. And in attraction and in struggles, I don't think it's ridiculous to emphasize that to an extent. So then, moving on, I think another thing that is very important for poets is to bring people together and to also even to bring nations together. That has been what poets like Homer and Walt Whitman did. That was what the best Dante, all of the some of the best poets in history, that was what they did, is that they brought nations together and they brought people together with their writing. And to an extent, they're also creating a new religion. They're creating a mythos. They are taking stories, either stories that they invented or stories that they've already heard about, and they're creating it into something. And they're taking the ideas of their nation across regions, and they're putting it into one thing. They're trying to create a sort of national identity and bring people together. And I think that that is very important for a poet to understand, is that their poetry should bring people together, and it should be celebrated as like a national treasure, something that can be celebrated across a nation specifically, but then across nations in general. For example, Homer, his poetry, the Iliad and the Odyssey, was celebrated across ancient Greece, across these different city-states, these rival city-states. His poetry was celebrated by all of them, and it was celebrated the way the way Christians celebrate the Bible. And I just think that's very interesting. And I think that that should be understood by poets, is that their role is not just being a philosopher and not just being a poet and not just being a psychologist, but also to an extent being some sort of prophet, because people will look at poets in that way. and people will read poetry in that way. So poets have to have this kind of understanding of the character of the nation that they're living in and write as if they're writing to that entire nation, because that's what Homer did, that's what Walt Whitman did, and that's what Dante did, and etc., etc. And that's why these people are still celebrated to this day. That's why these people are celebrated in their nation so much, because they were writing to an entire country, and they were writing a whole mythos, essentially. And I think that's important to remember. So, me personally, my poetry at first was more focused on my own personal uh, grievings, I guess, with the world. But as I've matured and as I've read more poetry and as I've uh, gone better as a poet, I have kind of taken this kind of view of myself in my own poetry that I should be writing poetry that can be read by anyone in America, anyone in the world, and I should write as if I'm writing to the whole country, and write as if I'm writing to a new religion, write as if I'm writing to people all across the world. And that, I think, is what poetry is for. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and goodbye.